The famous British philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote the following about the ontological argument.
The real question is there anything we can think of which, by the mere fact that we can think of it, is shown to exist outside our thought? Every philosopher would like to say yes, because a philosopher's job is to find out things about the world by thinking rather than observing. If yes is the right answer, there is a bridge from pure thought to things. If not, not.
Incidentally, Russell, however briefly, thought the argument worked. This is from his autobiography.
For 2 or 3 years, I was a Hegelian. I remember the exact moment during my 4th year, in 1894, when I became one. I had gone out to buy a tin of tobacco, and was going back with it along Trinity Lane, when I suddenly threw it up in the air and exclaimed, "Great God in boots, the ontological argument is sound."
But this was only a passing fancy, and Russell changed his mind. Being true to his logical empiricism, Russell went to his grave thinking God just did not provide enough evidence for his existence. Russell's framing of the problem explains why ontological arguments are so beguiling to philosophers. Is there a bridge from pure thought to God's existence? This seems dubious because we can think of many things, unicorns for example, that don't exist even though I can think of them. But God could be the exception. In other words, it may be possible to form an idea of God that will guarantee before and independent of experience, that God exists in the world outside my mind. So what is that idea of God? Here we will draw from Saint Anselm of Canterbury, who defined God as that than which nothing greater can be thought. Throughout, we will use the shorthand term greatness to refer to that than which nothing greater can be thought. To help us understand the meaning of greatness, we turn to Charles Hartshorne. But what is the meaning? Anselm replied with great simplicity. To be God is to be such that none greater can be conceived. And if you ask about the import of greater, the reply is X is greater than Y insofar as X is, and Y is not something which is better to be than not to be. Greater thus means superior, more excellent, more worthy of admiration and respect. Why does our saint choose this definition? I suppose because he takes it for granted that by God is the universal object of worship, and if God should have a superior, then only the ignorant or superstitious could worship him, not all creatures nor any reasonable creatures. Even though he is a critic of the argument, philosopher Brian Davies thinks it is reasonable to grant a prima facie case for the meaningfulness of greatness, even though serious objections have been raised over the centuries. Concerning the Judeo-Christian tradition, Davies states, the idea that God is unsurpassably great seems to be part and parcel of Judeo-Christian theism, and to say that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought seems to be a succinct way of capturing what those in the Judeo-Christian tradition mean by God. He goes further and finds that greatness is hardly unintelligible, and one can readily make sense of it. As a rule of thought, greatness allows us to entertain and reject any candidate for deity if we can think of something greater. If we can think of something greater than X, then X is not God. So how should we go about building the bridge from pure thought to the reality of God? The following argument will build on an article in issue 27 of the Process Studies supplement by the Center for Process Studies, where you can find all the references. Its title is Greatness and Necessity, a defense of Saint Anselm's modal ontological argument. Hereafter we will refer to it as the article or as Greatness and Necessity. This will not be an attempt to extract God's existence directly from greatness. Rather, we will build our bridge with pillars or premises supporting the conclusion that God exists. For a fuller explication and justification of the premises, see the article. We will begin by clarifying the existential modes for any concept and thing. After proposing a definition of God, the only mode of existence compatible with the meaning of God will be deduced. We've already introduced the greatness pillar or premise, and we will bring it back into our discussion after we further explicate the necessity pillar. The essentials of the necessity pillar are captured in Chapter 3 of St. Anselm's major work called the Proslogion. And certainly this being so truly exists that it cannot be even thought not to exist, for something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist, and this is greater than that which can be thought not to exist. Something which cannot even be thought not to exist is something which exists necessarily. Of course, folks like Hume, who believed in the universal contingency of existence, denied the possibility of necessary existence. But we are going to boldly assert it for reasons given in the article. In short, to deny necessary existence leads to contradictions. A more modern expression of something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist is suggested by Charles Hartshorne, and we will make that our first necessity premise. A term's intension is the definition that encompasses the list of properties that a thing needs to be labeled a cow or a cat, for example. The extension or denotation of a term is the set of things in the world to which the word or phrase refers. So, the intention of the President of the United States is the holder of supreme executive office created by the Constitution of the United States. The extension of this term is the class of all the presidents throughout history, starting with George Washington. Next, we identify the three possible modalities for every concept in the following manner, all three defined in terms of intension and extension. The concepts of cows, planets, islands, and other ordinary things are contingent concepts. A square circle or a married bachelor are examples of impossible concepts. The concept of God, we will argue, is a necessary concept. Some skeptics would even grant that one can conceive of, without contradiction, something whose intention requires some extension or other. However, they will not grant that the conceivability of a necessarily existing thing means that such a thing exists. For all we know, it is argued, what we conceive as existing necessarily might or might not exist. Our thoughts place no requirements on reality. To advance the argument, one therefore needs to assert that modality, including necessity, can not only be a property of concepts but also of things. So the focus needs to shift from the modality of concepts to the modality of existing things, the actual things being thought about. Of course, no thing exists impossibly, so the only applicable modes are necessary and contingent. But doesn't this premise rig the game in favor of God's existence? The answer is yes. Some kind of existence, contingent or necessary, is assumed. But this is forced on us if necessity is a modal option, if necessity can not only be logical, de dictu, but also ontological, de re. Next, we need to add an epistemological premise because we are claiming that modality is knowable a priori. Hartshorne explains that ordinary predicates neither exist necessarily nor necessarily fail to exist is inherent in their meanings. For they describe a conceivable sort of world which excludes other sorts likewise conceivable, and to do this belongs to their very function as predicates of the usual type. Similarly, self-contradictory predicates by their mere meanings necessarily do not exist. In these two cases, modal status inheres in the predicate itself. What then is incongruous in there being a third form of predication which, by its very meaning, neither excludes existence nor is neutral to it, existing if this possibility, but not if that possibility is actualized, but rather requires existence, exists no matter what possibility is actualized? No impartial person can, I think, deny that there is a certain completeness about this view which has an intellectual appeal. Modal status, it says, is always a priori or logical. But of the three forms of modality, contingency makes existence a question of extralogical facts. The others make it an a priori necessity, positive or negative. Now we introduce our definition of God. But what kind of concept is it, contingent, impossible, or necessary? To keep the argument going, we need to assert that greatness is conceivable and therefore not impossible. As noted before, serious objections have been raised over the centuries concerning the conceivability of greatness. One way to attack the concept is to allege that it involves contradictions, which render the concept impossible, so it is critical to advance a robust claim of conceivability. Greatness is not like a square circle. See the article Greatness and Necessity concerning how one can respond to such attacks. Ultimately, it should be recognized that skeptics themselves are not uniform concerning the conceivability of greatness. Certainly no advocate for the ontological argument, Bertrand Russell conceded that greatness is thinkable. At times, Graham Oppy, a prominent present-day critic of ontological arguments, concedes this as well. Even J.N. Findlay, author of the famous disproof of Anselm's argument, would find greatness conceivable but for the fact that it requires necessary existence. Therefore we conclude that the greatness pillar is supportable, although not through premises that are self-evident. The next premise asserts the great-making principle, namely that which exists necessarily is greater than that which exists contingently. With impossibility eliminated as a modal option, how do we eliminate contingency? We assume greatness exists contingently and then see what comes of it. We find that assuming that greatness exists contingently leads to a contradiction, for we can then think of something greater, namely that which exists necessarily. So we reject that assumption, which leaves only one other modal option for greatness, namely necessity. What exists necessarily must exist. Therefore God exists. To put a finer point on it, God's existence is unconditionally necessary. It is a metaphysical truth. Again, I refer you to the article for a fuller explanation and justification of the argument. Here is summary of the 13 steps of the argument. It must be admitted that this argument falls far short of indubitable proof, or what Aquinas would call a demonstration, a logically valid argument from premises that are self-evidently true or which rest on further propositions which are self-evident. Put another way, we didn't succeed in building a bridge from pure thought to God's existence. The greatness pillar needs extra-logical support. Perhaps it can be said that we succeeded in building a bridge from relatively pure thought. Once we gained the idea of greatness, however much its conceivability remains controversial, deducing God's existence, with the assistance of the necessity premises, was straightforward. However, we will argue, along with Charles Hartshorne, that this modal argument clears some ground in the perennial debate about God's existence. Whether there is an ontologically necessary being cannot be a contingent truth or a question of fact. If the idea of God makes sense, then he must exist because contingency is incompatible with greatness. The battleground is therefore over the meaningfulness of terms, not facts. When confronted with the argument, one must decide between two and only two options: a priori theism, or what Hartshorne calls positivism, the position that there is no coherent idea of God. If the idea of God is meaningful, his existence is necessary. If the idea of God is not meaningful, his non-existence is necessary. This is why careful atheists will not flatly claim that God does not exist, which implies that the idea of God is meaningful. Instead, they will claim that the idea of God is impossible. Perhaps this graphic will be helpful in understanding the forced choice. A priori theism affirms both the conceivability of God and also his necessary existence. The claim is that God's existence is analytic, necessary, and a priori. God is the unique case where these terms are coextensively applied. God is that individual whose existence is an analytic truth, given the meaning of greatness and necessity. If God exists, is analytically true, it is logically necessary. Because it is a necessary existential proposition, God's ontological necessity is affirmed. Finally, God exists, is true and knowable a priori just from the analysis of terms and the application of logic without recourse to experience. Positivism is the denial that there is a coherent idea of God, whether because the idea contains contradictions or because the idea of necessary existence is inconceivable. The upshot is that the concept of God is impossible. What one cannot do is grant that both greatness and necessity are conceivable but then conclude that God might or might not exist. That position is absurd. As noted at the beginning, Bertrand Russell rejected the argument. But he did say this about it.
The argument does not, to a modern mind, seem very convincing, but it is easier to feel convinced that it must be fallacious than it is to find out precisely where the fallacy lies.
With the proliferation of different versions of ontological arguments, this problem seems to have worsened. See especially Graham Oppy's article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for an overview of the many different versions. Hopefully the proposed argument from greatness and necessity does a good job in exposing all the essential premises which make it work, at least in the original Anselmian form from chapter 3 of the Proslogion. Hopefully, then all the possible lines of attack are exposed for the critic and proponent alike. When it comes to rejecting a premise of an argument, critics need to be reminded that rejection comes with a price. With respect to greatness, it bears repeating that defining God in terms of God's greatness has intuitive appeal to the religious person, as it is expressive of faith. And recall the earlier quote from Brian Davies. Concerning the Judeo-Christian tradition, Brian Davies states, "The idea that God is unsurpassably great seems to be part and parcel of Judeo-Christian theism, and to say that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought seems to be a succinct way of capturing what those in the Judeo-Christian tradition mean by God." So to reject greatness is to go against intuition and thousands of years of Judeo-Christian tradition. Rejecting necessity, however, arguably comes with a much higher price. The case for necessity proved to be surprisingly strong and maybe even self-evident, albeit through extended lines of reasoning. The approach taken is supporting necessity in general, was to show its denial leads to contradictions, which ought to be fatal to any philosophical position. The article exposed an irony worth emphasizing. In attacking this attempt to build an a priori bridge to God's existence, Anselm's critics engage in their own a priori. In his critique of Hume, which is also applicable to later critics such as Kant, Russell, the logical positivists, and contemporary analytic philosopher Graham Oppy, Hartshorne says, "Looking over Hume's procedure as a whole from the Anselmian point of view, we see the following. Anselm showed that greatness is inconceivable except as necessarily existing, from which it was a corollary that to deny the conceivability of necessary existent is to affirm God is inconceivable. Hence the universal contingency of existence affirmed by Hume as beyond all exception is the downright denial even of the thinkability of deity. The stark contradiction between such absolute empiricism and theism does not necessarily refute theism. Perhaps it rather refutes absolute empiricism. Moreover, the unqualified validity of empiricism cannot itself be an empirical truth. So, Hume is simply appealing to his own a priori against the religious a priori. It is his say-so against that of theistically religious mankind. In conclusion, greatness and necessity set out to build a bridge from pure thought to God's existence. It now seems that, in clarifying the possible modes of existence for any concept and thing, this was also an exercise in exposing a pre-existing bridge to God's existence. I hope you enjoyed this video. Here are some references you may find helpful.